The last day of Pat Garrett's life did not look like a legend. No dusty Main Street, no crowd pressed against storefront windows, no dramatic draw, no last words carried on the wind. Just a thin road outside Las Cruces, New Mexico, and the kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. The kind that feels like a warning. Pat Garrett had spent years standing at the edge of violence, close enough to smell it, close enough to be claimed by it. In the public mind, he would always be pinned to one moment when he shot Billy the Kid. But time has a way of stripping a man down to whatever is left when the stories stop paying. By 1908, Garrett was no longer the clean outline of a lawman in a dime novel. He was older, heavier, tired in a way that sleep couldn't repair. The West around him had changed its clothes. Rail lines, politics, land disputes, contracts, and money moved more quietly than gunfire, but they could ruin a man just as thoroughly. And Garrett, once the sheriff who hunted an outlaw, was now a man being hunted by debt, bad deals, and the slow collapse of reputation. He was born in 1850, a Southerner by origin, but the borderlands of New Mexico and Texas shaped him. He learned early that survival in the West wasn't a sermon. It was a calculation. He worked as a cowboy, a bartender, a man who drifted until he found a place that needed the kind of steadiness that could also turn hard. People like Garrett got hired because they were willing to do what polite men pretended not to see. When Lincoln County burned with violence in the late 1870s, the territory needed lawmen the way a fevered body needs ice. It was a time of ambushes and vendettas, and the line between law and gang could be as thin as a signature on a badge. It was in that chaos that Pat Garrett became sheriff, and it was there that Billy the Kid became a symbol, young, quick, reckless, and already half-myth. Garrett killed him in 1881 at Fort Sumner. That single act followed Garrett like a shadow for the rest of his life. Some praised him for ending a criminal career. Others called it murder wrapped in duty. Either way, the deed never loosened its grip. It was the moment the public kept pulling him back toward, like a hook in the mouth. And that is the quiet cruelty of legend. It turns a man into a single scene, then abandons him when the audience moves on. Garrett tried to build a life that wasn't only about that night. He worked as a rancher, held different law positions, and later took a federal job as a customs collector in El Paso. But jobs in the West were rarely just about competence. They were about alliances, patronage, politics, and Garrett's footing in that world was never secure. By the early 1900s, he was slipping. Money problems clung to him. The old status didn't buy stability. And the people who once wanted him close began to find him inconvenient. Too tied to old violence, too blunt, too much of a reminder. The West was modernizing, and modernizing has a talent for sweeping certain men into the gutter without ever admitting it. In southern New Mexico, Garrett owned a ranch and leased it out. It should have been simple: land, livestock, rent. But the West rarely allowed simple. The arrangement became tangled in dispute, especially over goats of all things. Goats were money if managed well, and a headache if they weren't. They could strip land bare, turn neighbors into enemies, ignite arguments that felt small until someone remembered how to hate. Garrett found himself in conflict with a man named Wayne Brazel, who was connected to the ranch lease. Another man, Carl Adamson, would also be part of the last day, an associate, a witness, a silhouette in the background of the killing. On February 29, 1908, Leap Day, a date that only appears every 4 years, Garrett set out on the road from the ranch toward Las Cruces. It was morning. The desert air could feel clean at that hour, as if the world hadn't yet decided what it was going to do to you. Garrett traveled in a wagon with Adamson. The road cut through open country. No walls, no corners, nowhere for secrets to hide, except in the empty space itself. They encountered Brazel along the way. 3 men, a simple meeting on a lonely road, the kind of encounter the West was built from. And then, within minutes, the legend ended. Garrett was shot and left by the side of the road. That's the shape of it, plain, ugly, unceremonious. The man who had been tied to the most famous outlaw of his time didn't die in a blaze. He died in a ditch of history, on a stretch of desert road where the wind didn't care who he was. The details have been argued for more than a century. How the confrontation unfolded, who moved first, what was said, what was true, what was convenient. Brazel claimed self-defense. Adamson, the only eyewitness, would later become a missing voice when it mattered most. The immediate aftermath had none of the romance people expect from the Old West. Brazel and Adamson returned to town. Brazel surrendered. The legal machinery turned slow, imperfect, and shaped by the same human pressures that shaped everything else. It wasn't a duel. It was paperwork, testimony, reputation, and the quiet power of who you knew. Time passed, and Garrett's death moved from shock to rumor to controversy. There were those who believed it was more than a simple argument turned deadly. Conspiracy clung to the story like dust. In a region where politics and land and influence were braided together, people asked who stood to gain from Garrett's silence. When the case went to trial in 1909, it carried the same bleak tone that hangs over many frontier justice stories. A man is dead, and the truth is not the main priority. The trial was short. The defense argued self-defense. The only eyewitness, Adamson, did not appear. Brazel was acquitted. That is how Pat Garrett's story collapsed into a final insult. No clear resolution, no satisfying ending, just a verdict that left the public to choose whatever version of the story fit their appetite. And then came the slow, humiliating part of any fallen legend's afterlife. What happens to the body, to the family, to the name, when the myth has already moved on? Garrett's funeral did not restore him to glory. It simply proved he was gone. He was buried in Las Cruces. The man whose name once carried weight had become a grave that could be visited, a date that could be carved, a story that could be retold until it lost its heat. Years later, a marker would be placed near the site where he died. Concrete and stone, a cross carved into memory. The desert around it stayed the same. That is one of the cruelest contrasts in Western history. Men's lives turn inside out, but the landscape barely changes its expression. Standing in that place, real or imagined, you can feel what makes this death so dark. It's not only that Garrett was killed, it's the way he was killed and the way it fit the pattern of his life. He lived in the space between outlaw and lawman, between admiration and suspicion, between fame and resentment. He served a West that needed violence to build itself, then watched that same West learn to speak in quieter threats. Garrett was never purely one thing. He wasn't a storybook hero. He wasn't a simple villain. He was a man of his time, capable, ambitious, flawed, and tethered to an act that the public refused to let go. For decades, he had been judged by one night at Fort Sumner. Yet in the end, it wasn't Billy the Kid that finished him. It was the ordinary brutality of the world Garrett helped shape. Disputes over land, money, contracts, and the kind of grudges that didn't need a famous name to become lethal. There's also a harder truth buried under all the arguments about who fired, who lied, who orchestrated what. Even if Brazel acted alone, even if it truly was a sudden conflict and a single trigger pull, that does not make the ending less bleak. Sometimes history is not shaped by grand design. Sometimes it's shaped by the simple fact that a man runs out of protection. In the West, reputation could be armor, but it could also be bait. Garrett's reputation attracted trouble. It attracted resentment. And when the armor cracked, when he became vulnerable, financially strained, politically isolated, his name didn't save him. It only made his fall more satisfying to the people who wanted him humbled. This is where the story becomes more than a death on a roadside. It becomes a lesson about the kind of country the frontier was, and the kind of myth America built from it. We remember the gunman and the sheriff as if they were opposite ends of a clean moral line. But the frontier rarely drew clean lines. It drew survival lines. A lawman could be feared like an outlaw. An outlaw could be mourned like a folk saint. Men moved through those roles the way a man moves through weather, sometimes by choice, sometimes because the storm pushed him there. Pat Garrett became famous for ending Billy the Kid. But in doing so, he stepped into the same darkness he was hired to fight. The West rewarded him with a legend and punished him with a life he couldn't quite escape. And when the final moment came, it did not arrive as a climax. It arrived as an erasure, a lonely road, a shot, a body left behind, a trial that ended quickly, a verdict that didn't heal anything, and a marker in the desert that tries, too late, to make the place feel important. In the end, that is the real tragedy of many Western legends. They don't die in the way the world expects them to. They die in the way the world truly works. Quietly, unfairly, and sometimes on a day that barely exists on the calendar at all.